This is my true story. I raised a daughter who once held my hand and said I was her hero. I built her a home, paid her college fees, and gave her every comfort I could afford. When she found love, I thought her wedding day would be my proudest moment. Instead, it became the day she broke me. She looked me in the eyes and said, "Don't come. You'll ruin it." I stood there silent, holding the invitation I paid for, and what I did next changed everything. Before I continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is, and subscribe so more people hear my story. I raised my daughter alone after her mother passed away. We lived in a small house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. I remember patching that old roof during winters, working late nights at the factory, and coming home to find her asleep on the couch with her schoolbooks open. Every moment of my life was built around her future. I skipped meals so she could have new shoes, took extra shifts so she could join field trips, and sold my father's gold watch, the only thing he left me, just to pay her college admission. When she got accepted, she cried, hugged me, and said I was her hero. That moment made every sacrifice feel worth it. As the years went on, she grew distant. It started small. Fewer phone calls, short visits during holidays, new friends who looked down on where we lived. She got a job in the city, and I told her to chase her dreams, to never forget where she came from. I didn't know that one day she would try to erase the very hands that built her world. I used to sit on the porch and wait for her calls that never came. The phone would stay silent for weeks, sometimes months. When she did visit, it was brief, hurried, always checking the time, always somewhere else in her mind. Still, I smiled and told her how proud I was. I thought love was about patience. I thought she'd come around. When she told me she was getting married, I felt a warmth I hadn't felt in years. She said she wanted a small ceremony, something elegant, simple, close to home. I offered to host it in the same house her mother and I built from scratch. The walls still smelled of her childhood. The garden still bloomed with the roses her mother planted before she passed. My heart swelled with pride thinking that house would see joy again after so many years of loneliness. I spent days fixing the gate, repainting the porch, trimming the yard. I didn't mind the ache in my knees. I wanted her big day to be perfect. I imagined her walking down the aisle, smiling, her mother's picture framed near the altar. I thought, maybe for one day, I'd feel whole again. But money changes people faster than time ever can. Her fiancé came from a well-off family, polished, proud, all suits and smooth words. They visited once before the wedding. I noticed how my daughter spoke differently around them. Her laughter felt forced, her tone sharper. She looked at my hands, rough and cracked from years of work, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Embarrassment. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake thinking of how small she must have felt standing next to them, and how ashamed she must have been of me. But even then, I forgave her in my heart. A week later, she called. Her voice was calm, distant. She said she was grateful for everything I had done, but that she thought it would be better if I didn't attend the wedding. She said the guests were different, people who might not understand old-fashioned ways. I held the phone in silence, staring at the photo of her mother on the shelf. My throat burned, but no words came out. I just nodded, even though she couldn't see me. She said, "You'll understand someday," and hung up. I sat there for hours, my heart heavy, my hands shaking, the sound of the rain outside blending with the silence inside. For the next few days, I wandered through that house, every corner holding a memory. The kitchen where she used to sit doing homework, the stairs she once climbed with laughter echoing through the halls. I thought about the years of labor, the debts I paid, the meals I skipped, all so she could have everything. And yet, somehow, she saw me as something to hide. I didn't feel anger at first, just emptiness. A quiet, cold kind of pain that sat deep in the bones. Still, I prepared a small gift, a letter and an old photo of her and her mother, hoping she might still let me watch from afar. I didn't want to ruin her happiness. I only wanted to see her smile one last time. But I didn't know that the day I tried to do that would be the day she'd break me completely, and the day I'd finally decide what a father's last lesson should look like. The morning of her wedding came dressed in sunlight and silence. I woke up early, long before the world stirred. My hands trembled as I buttoned my old gray suit, the same one I had worn to her college graduation. I looked in the mirror and saw a man who had given everything, a man whose wrinkles were carved from years of love and labor. Outside, the sky was clear, the air still, but inside me, something heavy refused to settle. I told myself I wasn't going to the wedding, that I would respect her wish. But when I stood at the door, I couldn't stop myself. I just wanted to see her, to make sure she was happy, to say goodbye quietly from afar. The drive was short, but it felt endless. The house glowed from a distance. The same house I built with my bare hands 40 years ago. The porch I had sanded, the walls I had painted, the trees I had planted. Now it was wrapped in flowers and lights, full of laughter I didn't belong to. My heart thudded as I parked a few blocks away. I walked slowly, careful not to be seen, but curiosity pulled me closer. From the gate, I could see her, my daughter, standing in her white gown, radiant and perfect. Her smile was wide, her eyes bright. For a moment, pride drowned the pain. I thought, that's my little girl. I almost turned around to leave quietly, content to have seen her joy. But then she saw me. Her expression changed in an instant. Joy froze into anger, pride into disgust. She turned pale, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, she said, "I shouldn't be there." Her words cut through the crowd like a blade. The music stopped. Heads turned. Her fiancé's family whispered among themselves. I froze where I stood, my heart pounding in my chest. She took a step closer, her face stiff with rage. "I told you not to come," she said, her tone cold, sharp, final. A few guests laughed nervously. The groom looked down. I wanted to explain. I wanted to tell her I wasn't there to interrupt, just to see her from a distance, to bless her quietly. But my mouth wouldn't open. My body felt heavy, my knees weak. The laughter in the background grew louder, cruel, mocking, distant. I heard someone whisper, "Who is that old man?" And another voice answered, "Her father, I think." That word, father, sounded hollow in that moment. She turned away from me, pretending I wasn't there. I stood still, clutching the small envelope in my hand, the letter I had written for her, the photo of her mother inside. I had written words of love, of pride, of forgiveness. Now they felt meaningless. My eyes burned as I watched the people I once welcomed into my home now look at me like an intruder. A few waiters whispered behind the tent. The music started again. She laughed, forced, hollow, and returned to her guests as though nothing had happened. I stood there for a few more seconds, my feet refusing to move. The sound of her laughter, so close to the one her mother once had, now felt foreign, sharp. I turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last. The path that once led me to her school, her birthdays, her dreams, now led me out of her life. By the time I reached the street, the music had started again. I could hear the rhythm echoing behind me, muffled by distance, but every beat felt like a nail in my chest. I looked back one last time. The house glowed in gold and white, full of people who celebrated under a roof I had built, a roof she had claimed as her own. She didn't even know she was dancing beneath my name written in the deed. I walked back home alone. The road felt longer this time, darker, even though the sun was still high. I didn't cry on the way back. My tears had dried years ago. But when I reached my porch and looked at the old hammer still hanging by the door, I realized something. Every nail, every board, every brick in that house carried my fingerprints, and she had forgotten them all. That night, I made myself a promise. If she wanted to erase me, then I would erase myself from that house too, but not before taking away the comfort she built on top of my work. She had turned me into a stranger. The next morning, I decided to remind her who had built the life she stood on. The wedding day arrived like a celebration meant for everyone but me. The sky was bright, the air carried the smell of roses, and music echoed down the street. Every car that passed was filled with laughter and perfume. I sat on the porch for a long time, holding her photo from when she was 6, missing front teeth, wearing her mother's old necklace, smiling like the world was kind. Then I stood up, brushed the dust off my jacket, and started walking toward the house I had built. My steps were slow, heavy, but my heart pulled me forward. I told myself I'd just watch from a distance, nothing more. I didn't want to embarrass her. I just wanted to see her begin the life I'd spent years preparing her for. When I reached the end of the street, the sound of the celebration filled my ears. Laughter, applause, the clinking of glasses. People moved in and out of the yard wearing fancy clothes I'd never seen before. The place looked beautiful. The walls I once painted by hand now wrapped in flowers, the windows glowing with soft gold light. I stood near the gate, hidden behind a line of cars. I could see her clearly now. My daughter. She looked radiant in her white dress, surrounded by people who adored her. For a second, my chest filled with pride. Every drop of sweat, every sleepless night, every lonely dinner had been worth it, or so I thought. I took one step forward, just enough for her to notice me. Her smile froze the moment our eyes met. The laughter around her faded, and then I heard her voice, sharp and cold. She said she had told me not to come. The guests turned to look. I froze where I stood, the gift I had brought clutched in my trembling hands, a letter from her mother's journal, wrapped in a white ribbon. Her groom looked away, embarrassed. The bridesmaids exchanged whispers. Someone at the back laughed quietly. My daughter's face turned hard, her eyes full of the same shame I once saw when she compared our small home to her rich friends. She raised her hand and motioned for the security guard to block me. For a second, I thought I might be dreaming. My feet refused to move. I heard her voice again, louder this time, breaking through the music. She said I didn't belong there. The laughter that followed burned through me. I felt small, smaller than I had ever been in my life. I looked around at the faces, people I didn't know, people standing under the roof I built, eating food bought with my money. The house that held her childhood was now filled with strangers who looked at me like an intruder. I tried to speak, but no words came. My throat tightened, my chest ached. The security guard stepped forward and asked me to leave. My eyes stung, but I held my head up. I wanted to remember her face, not the woman yelling at me, but the little girl who once hugged me every morning before school. I turned and walked away slowly. The sound of laughter followed me down the path. I didn't look back. As I reached the end of the street, the music started again. The same walls I once painted echoed with cheers. She was walking down the aisle, smiling for the cameras, pretending I had never existed. Every brick, every door, every flower had my fingerprints on it. Yet in that moment, it felt like the world had erased me completely. When I reached home, I didn't cry. I sat in the dark, staring at the floor, and realized something cruel but true. Love built on pride dies quietly. My daughter had replaced her memories with convenience. She had traded her roots for reputation. And while the world clapped for her happiness, I sat in the house next door, holding the paper that proved who still owned it. That night, the sound of music faded, replaced by silence and the hum of the wind. I knew what I had to do. She had chosen to humiliate me in the very home I gave her. So I decided that home would no longer be hers to stand in. The night after the wedding felt heavier than any night before. The celebration lights still flickered faintly through my window from across the street. Laughter and music had ended, but their echoes lingered like ghosts in the air. I sat alone at the small kitchen table, my hands folded, the room dark except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. On the wall hung the family photo we had taken years ago. She was 10, smiling, sitting between her mother and me. Back then, life felt whole. I stared at that picture for a long time until the edges blurred through my tears. I had never cried easily, not even when her mother died. But that night, I did. Quietly. Not because of anger, but because something inside me had finally broken. Outside, the air smelled of wet soil. The yard lights from the house glowed faintly, like the world mocking me. I could see silhouettes moving around, maybe guests staying the night, maybe workers cleaning up. I thought about the years I spent fixing that place. Every nail hammered by my hand, every floorboard polished by my sweat. I had built it when I was young and full of dreams, imagining that one day she would live there, raise her children there, and remember me as the man who built her world. I never imagined I'd live long enough to see it turn into a place where I wasn't welcome. The clock ticked slowly, each second heavier than the last. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the moment she shouted at me, the faces of those strangers laughing, the look of disgust in her eyes. I remembered how small she was when she used to run through those same hallways, her laughter echoing against the walls. I remembered the nights she would wake up scared of thunderstorms, and I'd hold her until she fell asleep again. I remembered how she used to call me hero, and now, in that same house, I had become ashamed to hide. I stood up and walked to my desk. The old deed lay there, a thin stack of yellowed papers, brittle with age. I had kept it safe through years of hardship, through bills, debts, and bank calls. My name was printed clearly across the top. I traced the letters slowly, my fingers trembling. She had never asked to see it. She just assumed the house was hers because I had given her everything else. She had taken my silence for surrender. I opened the drawer and pulled out the key to my safe box. Inside were a few things that mattered: my wife's ring, our wedding photo, and the signed ownership documents of the house. Everything else could vanish. Those were the only pieces of my life that held meaning. I sat there for hours, looking between the deed and the family photo, feeling something shift inside me. The sadness began to fade, replaced by a calm kind of resolve, the kind that comes when a man has nothing left to lose. The lights across the street went out one by one. The night grew still. Somewhere, a car started, then silence again. I could almost hear the hum of the wind brushing against the trees I had planted decades ago. They were tall now, taller than the roof of the house. They had grown like she had, strong and stubborn, reaching for light, forgetting the soil that fed them. I looked up at the clock. It was 3:17 a.m. My tears had dried, and the air in the room felt clearer, sharper. I whispered to myself, "Enough." That word filled the silence like a heartbeat. I folded the deed carefully, slipped it into a folder, and placed it on the table. My decision was already made. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to beg for respect. I had built that house with my hands, and I still had the right to take it away with my name. As dawn crept through the blinds, the world began to stir again. Birds started to sing, soft and distant. I poured myself a cup of coffee and watched the light spread slowly across the floor. There was peace in me now, a quiet kind of strength that comes after heartbreak. She had humiliated me in front of a crowd, but I would remind her, silently and powerfully, who gave her everything she stood upon. By sunrise, I was already dressed, the deed tucked under my arm, and my old truck engine humming in the driveway. My first stop would be my lawyer's office. The morning sun came up pale, weak, struggling through the clouds, the kind of light that makes everything look older than it is. I drove slowly into town, past the same road I had driven 1,000 times before. The streets were quiet, the air cold, and the small stores along the way were just beginning to open. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as I thought about what I was about to do. This wasn't anger anymore. It was clarity, the kind that only comes after you've been broken so completely that nothing else can hurt you. My heart didn't race. It didn't ache. It just beat steadily, one slow reminder that I was still here. When I reached the lawyer's office, the same man who had helped me file the deed 30 years ago greeted me with tired eyes. He was older now, grayer, slower, but he remembered me. He asked about my daughter, about the wedding, and I said quietly, "It's done." He nodded slowly, the kind of nod that comes when someone already knows there's a story behind the silence. I handed him the papers, the original property deed, the ownership certificates, the land registration slips, every single proof that still bore my name. The ink had faded, but the truth hadn't. He looked them over carefully, his glasses sliding down his nose. "You still own it," he said. "Completely." Those words hit me harder than I expected. They weren't new, I already knew it. But hearing them aloud felt like confirmation from the universe itself. The house that had been used to shame me was still mine in every legal, moral, and spiritual way. Every brick was paid for by my sweat. Every wall stood because of my hands. My daughter might have forgotten, but the papers hadn't. I sat back in the chair and looked around the room. The smell of old paper, dust, and coffee filled the air. A faint hum came from the air conditioner. Outside the window, I could see people walking past, young, rushed, unaware. For them, life was still about building. For me, it had come full circle. I had built my legacy, and now I was watching it fall apart, piece by piece, not from age or decay, but from betrayal. The lawyer asked if I was sure about selling. I nodded. He hesitated for a moment, as if waiting for me to change my mind. I didn't. He opened his drawer and pulled out a file. "There's still strong interest in that property," he said. "The land's good, and the house has value." I smiled faintly. "Then let's make it valuable to someone else." He started typing, his fingers slow and deliberate on the keyboard. The sound of each key felt like a heartbeat echoing through the room. I stared at the wall, thinking of my daughter's laughter from years ago, not the cruel one from yesterday, but the innocent one from her childhood. The way she used to run down the hall calling my name. The way she'd sit on the floor helping her mother wrap gifts at Christmas. I realized in that moment that love doesn't die when people change. It just hardens. It becomes something else. A quiet, sharp kind of strength. As he printed the documents, I noticed how steady my hands were. No shaking, no hesitation. The pen felt firm and light in my grip as I signed my name. Each stroke of ink was clean, calm, final. By the time I was done, the house, that house full of memories and betrayal, was officially on the market. A stranger would soon walk through its halls, breathe its air, stand where I once stood. And that thought, strangely, didn't hurt. When I stepped out of the office, the wind was cold, but the sun had broken through the clouds. I stopped by a diner on the corner and ordered black coffee. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, asked how my day was going. I told her it was the first good day I'd had in years. She smiled, not knowing what I meant. I looked out the window and watched cars rush by, feeling a stillness inside me that I hadn't felt in a long time. Back at home, I placed the signed documents neatly on the table. The deal would close soon. She didn't know yet. But soon she would. And not because I told her, but because the world would show her. The same walls she had decorated for her wedding would soon belong to someone else. And when she realized that the foundation beneath her joy had shifted, she'd finally understand what it feels like to lose something you thought you owned forever. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The papers rustled softly in the wind that came through the open window. My heart didn't feel revengeful, just peaceful. I had built her everything. Now, I was taking back the one thing she never earned, my silence. The next morning came with the sound of rain tapping against the window, gentle, steady, almost peaceful. I woke early, earlier than I had in years. My mind was calm. The kind of calm that doesn't come from happiness, but from acceptance. I brewed my coffee, black and strong, the way I used to drink it before life softened me. Outside, the streets glistened under the rain. The sky hung low, gray and heavy, but it didn't bother me. Something inside me had already cleared. The night before, I had signed away the past. Today, I would let go of the last piece of it. I sat at the table with the paperwork spread neatly before me. Contracts, bank slips, authorization letters, all ready for the sale. My lawyer had already found a buyer, a quiet man who wanted the property for its land value. He didn't care about the story or the memories. Maybe that was what made it easier. The house that had witnessed my daughter's laughter, her rebellion, and her betrayal was now just a line item in a transaction. I didn't need sentiment anymore. I needed peace. The lawyer called around 9. He said everything was ready. "The buyer's on his way," he told me. His tone was cautious, like he was speaking to a man on the edge. But I wasn't on the edge anymore. I was standing firmly in the middle of the storm, unmoved. I told him I'd be there within the hour. I dressed neatly, ironed shirt, clean jacket, polished shoes. The same care I used to take when attending her school events or parent meetings. It's strange how endings make us tidy. Driving through town, I passed the flower shop where I used to buy roses for her birthdays, the diner where we once shared pancakes on Sundays, the park where she learned to ride a bike. Each place passed like a quiet goodbye. No pain, no anger. Just the closing of a book I had read too many times. When I reached the lawyer's office, the rain had stopped. The buyer was already there. A tall man in his 40s, polite, firm handshake, businesslike eyes. He smiled faintly, not out of joy but courtesy. "Beautiful property," he said, flipping through the documents. "Old craftsmanship. Solid structure." I nodded, saying nothing. The lawyer read through the contract slowly, each word falling like a nail sealing a coffin. I listened in silence, my thoughts drifting to the house. The front porch where I had carried her on my shoulders, the living room where her mother once sang softly while dusting shelves, the kitchen where we shared our last meal as a family. Every corner of that home was a piece of me. But not anymore. When the lawyer handed me the pen, I didn't hesitate. I signed once, twice, then closed the folder. My handwriting looked older than I remembered. Thin, fragile, but steady. The buyer smiled again and handed me the envelope with the payment confirmation. I didn't even open it. The money wasn't the point, it was the act itself. Quiet, simple, irreversible. By evening, everything was done. The sale was official. I walked out of the building into the cool air, the rain now reduced to a mist. The streets were slick, reflecting the pale light of passing cars. I stopped near a bakery and bought a loaf of bread, something simple to mark the end of something complicated. When I reached home, I placed the envelope on the table beside her old photograph. Her eyes looked at me from the frame, younger, full of trust, unaware of the future. I whispered softly, "It's done." That night I sat by the window and watched the lights go out across the neighborhood. Somewhere across town, she was still celebrating, still believing the world was hers. She didn't know yet that the ground beneath her had shifted. The home she called hers no longer belonged to her. The same roof under which she humiliated me would soon belong to a stranger. But I didn't feel vengeance. I felt release. For years, I had carried the weight of sacrifice, the burden of love that gave too much. Selling that house wasn't revenge. It was the moment I laid that burden down. I had spent decades being her foundation. That night, I chose to become my own. As I turned off the lamp, the room fell into quiet. The house I still lived in felt lighter, freer, almost new. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with noise or fire. Sometimes it comes with the sound of a single pen stroke, the closing of a folder, and a silence that finally feels like peace. The day she said, "I do," the world was bright, loud, and full of people who believed they were watching the perfect beginning. I wasn't there in the crowd, but I didn't need to be. I knew every inch of that house. The creak in the staircase, the soft hum of the pipes, the sunlight that fell through the kitchen window around noon. I knew exactly where she stood when she said those words. The air around me felt heavy, but my mind was clear. While she smiled for cameras, I sat at my lawyer's office, signing the final set of sale documents. The irony was almost poetic, her vows being spoken in a house that was already slipping out of her hands. Across town, the ceremony had begun. Guests clapped, music filled the rooms, and laughter spilled out of the open doors. She wore the dress I paid for, the same one she had shown me months ago with tears in her eyes, saying, "You'll be proud, Dad." She had said those words before she decided I was an embarrassment. Now, she stood under chandeliers I installed with my bare hands, reciting vows about loyalty and love, surrounded by people who had never lifted a brick in their lives. Her voice trembled with emotion, but I wondered if guilt touched her heart even once. At the exact moment she said, "I do," I pressed my pen to paper. The buyer's signature had already dried. The house, my house, was officially no longer hers. The lawyer looked at me as if expecting a reaction, but I felt nothing except the stillness of a man who had finally seen the truth. I didn't sell it out of rage. I sold it because I couldn't bear to let my work be the stage for my humiliation. I thought of her laughter when she told me not to come, the way she turned away when I stood at the gate, and I knew then that the only way to reclaim my dignity was through silence and finality. As she kissed her husband, people cheered, photographers clicked their cameras, immortalizing a joy that had been built on cruelty. The same walls that once heard her cry as a child now echoed with music and vanity. The same floor where she took her first steps now held the weight of her pride. Every corner of that house held a ghost, her mother's voice, my laughter, our memories, and she had turned them into decoration. But even as she danced under those lights, the truth was already in motion. By the time they cut the cake, the property had changed hands. By the time guests raised their glasses, the legal papers had been processed. I left the office quietly, stepping into the warm afternoon sun. The town buzzed with normal life, children running, cars passing, wind rustling through the trees. No one knew that somewhere nearby, a wedding was being celebrated in a house that no longer belonged to the bride. I walked slowly, stopping once to sit on a bench outside a small diner. I watched people move about, strangers, families, couples, all chasing moments of happiness that would someday turn to memories. I thought about how life moves in circles. We build, we give, we lose, and then we learn to let go. By evening, the sky turned orange. I imagined her stepping onto the porch for photos, smiling as the photographer told her to look happy. The papers had already been filed at the registry by then. Her joy existed in a house that no longer carried her name. I wondered if she felt anything strange in that moment. Maybe a sudden chill, a sense of something ending even as everything looked perfect. Sometimes, I think the soul knows when a foundation begins to shift. As the night deepened, music filled the air again. I could hear faint echoes from across the distance, laughter, fireworks, a song she used to dance to as a child. I closed my eyes and let the sound fade. She had her celebration. I had my closure. When I returned home, I poured myself a glass of water and looked out the window. The world outside was quiet now, and I felt a peace I hadn't felt in years. She might never know the exact moment her future changed, but I did. It happened when she said, "I do," in a house that no longer belonged to her. It was late that night when the storm of celebration turned into silence. The lights in the house flickered off one by one. The guests began to leave, and the sound of music was replaced by the soft hum of cars fading into the distance. I sat in my chair by the window, watching from across the street. The rain had started again, light, slow, unhurried, the kind that carries memories instead of thunder. I could see her through the curtains, still wearing her wedding dress, laughing with her new husband, unaware of what the next few hours would bring. The world around her was full of joy and ignorance. My world, across the street, was quiet and knowing. Then, close to midnight, I saw headlights. A car pulled up to the house, and two men stepped out. One held a briefcase, the other carried a file folder, the new owner and his representative. They walked to the gate, spoke briefly with the security guard, and then knocked firmly on the door. I didn't need to hear the words. I knew the script. The transaction was done, the ownership transferred, the house no longer hers. Everything that was once home to her now belonged to someone else. From where I sat, I could see confusion spread through the room. Faces turned, hands gestured, the music stopped. Her husband came to the door first, smiling politely as he spoke to the men. Then his face changed. His smile fell, replaced by disbelief, then panic. The new owner handed him the documents, thick, stamped, official. He read them once, twice, then called for my daughter. She appeared, still radiant in her gown but now pale, her posture collapsing under the weight of something she didn't yet understand. I could almost read her lips as she asked what was happening. The new owner pointed toward the papers. She shook her head, laughed nervously, thinking it was a mistake. The word mistake was one she had never used for her own choices, only for others. But now it followed her like a shadow. Within minutes, her laughter turned to pleading. I could hear faint voices rising from across the street. The kind of tone that comes when people realize the ground under them isn't as solid as they thought. Guests whispered, some started leaving, others simply stood in awkward silence. The man who married her looked at her differently now. Not with love, but with a quiet, uncertain disappointment. The kind that says, "What have you done?" Police cars arrived soon after, not to arrest anyone, but to enforce the law. The papers were clear. The property had been sold legally. The new owner had every right to take possession. The officers spoke politely but firmly, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like truth through pride. One of them asked everyone to leave until the situation could be resolved. I could see her shake her head over and over, tears smudging her makeup. She kept saying, "This can't be real." But it was. It was as real as the ink on the papers she never cared to read. From my window, I watched her step outside, barefoot now, holding the bottom of her dress to keep it from dragging through the mud. She looked lost, small, the way she used to look when she was a child and couldn't find her mother in a crowd. The guests avoided her eyes, hurrying into their cars. Her husband tried to comfort her, but his face said enough. Their perfect night had turned into humiliation. She glanced around, as if searching for something, or someone, to blame. For a moment, her eyes lifted and met mine through the rain. She froze. Maybe she knew. Maybe she finally understood. The officers closed the gate behind them. The lights went out. The laughter, the music, the cheers, all gone. The house that once echoed with celebration now stood empty, silent, reclaimed by the same quiet that had always belonged to me. I didn't move from my chair. I just watched as she broke in the very place that was supposed to be her triumph. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel victory. I just felt an end. Cold, clean, and final. For 30 years, that house had been a symbol of love, sacrifice, and family. That night, it became something else. Proof that respect cannot be bought, and that pride built on betrayal always collapses. My daughter learned that truth the hardest way a person can, not through words, not through scolding, but through silence and consequence. The morning after the chaos felt eerily quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a sky that looked tired and gray. I woke to the sound of birds, the same sound that used to mean peace, but now it felt like silence trying too hard to fill the air. I made my coffee, walked out to the porch, and sat down facing the house across the street. It looked different now, not because of the weather, but because of what had happened. The once bright yard was littered with fallen flowers, chairs overturned, decorations half torn. The joy had left faster than the guests. What remained was a hollow shell of what she had built on lies and pride. By noon, I heard the rumors start to spread. In small towns, news travels faster than the wind. "Bride loses house on her wedding day," someone said at the store. "Her father sold it while she was saying her vows," another whispered near the bakery. I didn't try to correct them. Let them talk. Every story starts with gossip, but the truth, the full truth, always finds its way through. I just listened quietly as the words rippled through the town, carrying pieces of me I no longer cared to explain. My phone rang several times that day. Her name flashed on the screen again and again. I didn't answer. She left voicemails, first confused, then angry, then pleading. "Dad, please call me back," she said in one. "We can fix this," in another. But some things aren't broken. They're finished. I deleted every message. The silence that followed felt heavy, but it was the kind of weight I could finally bear. Her husband tried calling next. His tone was different, stern, polite, distant. He said he understood what I did, but asked if there was a way to reverse the situation. I told him calmly that there wasn't. The sale was final, the documents were sealed, and the ownership had changed hands completely. He stayed quiet for a few seconds before hanging up. I knew that was the last time I'd hear from him. By the end of the week, the story had reached everyone. The new owners moved in quietly, a couple with 2 small children, humble and kind. They greeted me when they saw me outside and thanked me for selling them the place. They didn't know the history, and I didn't tell them. They just saw a house, not the ghosts inside it. For me, that was enough. Let someone else fill those walls with laughter. Mine had already faded long ago. My daughter, though, didn't take it well. I heard she had moved into a small apartment in the city, her marriage already falling apart. People said her husband couldn't handle the embarrassment, that his family cut ties after the scandal. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I just sat by my window each evening, watching the sun fall over the house I no longer owned, feeling something that wasn't revenge, but peace. The kind that comes only after decades of giving and one act of taking back what's yours. She came by once, a few weeks later. I saw her car pull up, but I didn't open the door. She sat outside for a while, crying quietly. Her face looked different, not angry anymore, not proud, just tired. I wanted to hold her, but I stayed still. Some lessons aren't taught with words. They're learned in silence. Eventually, she drove away. I watched her taillights fade into the distance and knew, in my heart, that she understood. The new family's children played in the yard now. I could hear their laughter on weekends, the same laughter I used to hear when she was small. The sound didn't hurt. It healed. The house no longer carried my pain. It carried their future. I had given that home one last purpose, to protect a family that still knew how to love. I sat back, the sun warm against my face, and thought about the strange way life balances itself. I had lost a daughter the night she gained a husband, but in a quiet, twisted way, I had also found myself again. The man who once gave everything had finally kept something for himself, his dignity. Weeks passed, and the noise of what had happened began to fade like a distant storm. People stopped talking. The new family settled in, planting flowers in the front yard, repainting the fence, laughing in the evenings when the lights came on. I would sit on my porch every night, watching quietly from across the street. The same house that once stood as a monument to my sacrifices now stood as proof that pain, when faced with patience, can turn into peace. Sometimes I wondered if the walls remembered me, if they still carried the echo of my hammering, the rhythm of my footsteps, the sound of my daughter's laughter before pride changed her heart. I didn't hate her. Even after everything, I couldn't. Hate is too heavy for an old man to carry. I had already carried enough: grief, loneliness, disappointment. What I felt now wasn't hate or regret. It was something quieter, deeper. It was understanding. I realized that love doesn't always mean holding on. Sometimes love means letting someone fall hard enough to hear the truth echo in their bones. My daughter had chosen pride over family, and I had chosen silence over pleading. Somewhere in the middle of that, life taught both of us its cruelest lesson. You cannot build happiness on the foundation of betrayal. Every morning I still made 2 cups of coffee out of habit. One for me, one for memory. The second cup always went cold, but I liked the look of it sitting there. It reminded me that love, even when abandoned, leaves behind traces that time can't erase. I would walk to the edge of the porch, breathe in the morning air, and watch the children play in the yard. They filled that space with something it had long lost: innocence. I imagined my daughter's younger self among them, running barefoot through the grass, her mother's laughter chasing her in the wind. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, I received a letter. It was from her. The envelope was thin, the handwriting shaky but familiar. I sat down slowly and opened it. Inside was a single page. No long explanations, no excuses, just a few sentences. She wrote that she finally understood, that she had built her happiness on my effort but never saw the cracks forming beneath it, that she was sorry for forgetting where she came from. And at the bottom, in smaller letters, she wrote, "You were right to sell it." It was never mine to begin with. I stared at those words until the ink seemed to blur. My hands trembled, not with anger this time, but with release. After decades of working, waiting, forgiving, I had finally been seen, not as an embarrassment, not as a burden, but as a father. I didn't write back. There was nothing left to say. Forgiveness isn't always spoken. Sometimes it's just the absence of bitterness. That night, I slept better than I had in years. The air felt softer, the house warmer. The silence no longer screamed, it hummed gently, like peace itself had taken a seat beside me. The days that followed were simple. I tended my garden, repaired old tools, and watched the seasons change. The maple tree outside my porch turned golden, its leaves falling in slow spirals. Life had finally come full circle. The man who once gave everything had taken back his peace. The daughter who once turned away had learned the cost of pride, and the house that once broke me had become a home again for someone who deserved it. Sometimes, at night, I still hear faint music coming from the distance, wedding songs from another event, laughter from another family. And I smile. Because I know now that not every story of loss is a tragedy. Some are just beginnings written in different ink. I was the father who built everything with my hands. She was the daughter who tried to erase me with words. But in the end, time has a strange way of teaching what pride refuses to learn. Final thought. She kicked me out of her wedding and said, "Don't come back." So I sold the very floor she stood on, not out of spite, but to remind her that love, when disrespected, can still walk away with dignity, and that sometimes the quietest revenge is peace.